On May 1st, 2011, the President of the United States appeared on television and announced that Osama bin Laden was dead. For millions of people, it felt like closure. A decade of fear, anger, and unanswered questions seemed to end in a single speech. The most wanted man in the world was gone. Justice had been served, and the story appeared complete. But history does not work like a movie. The real story of Osama bin Laden does not begin with terrorism, nor with hatred of the West. It begins decades earlier, inside the machinery of Cold War geopolitics. In the late 1970s and 1980s, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, triggering one of the most brutal proxy wars of the Cold War. The United States did not fight directly. Instead, it funded, armed, and supported Islamist fighters known as the Mujahideen through covert CIA programs, most notably Operation Cyclone. These fighters were not considered enemies. They were useful allies in a larger strategic game aimed at bleeding the Soviet Union. Osama bin Laden emerged from this environment as a wealthy Saudi volunteer, deeply religious but also deeply political. He was not a frontline commander. His real power came from money, logistics, and organization. Using his family fortune, he financed training camps, built supply networks, and helped recruit fighters from across the Arab world. During this period, bin Laden had no conflict with the United States. On the contrary, his activities aligned with American strategic interests. The idea that he was always an inevitable enemy is a myth created later. When the Soviet Union withdrew from Afghanistan, the geopolitical landscape changed. The Cold War ended, and former allies were suddenly no longer useful. For bin Laden, the turning point came in 1990 during the Gulf War, when Saudi Arabia allowed American troops to be stationed on its soil. To him, this was a profound betrayal. Foreign soldiers near Islam's holiest sites became the foundation of his radicalization. From that moment, his worldview shifted. The enemy was no longer Moscow. It was Washington. What followed was not born from madness, but from a collision between global power politics, religious extremism, and unresolved consequences of past alliances. To understand what happened next, it is necessary to look beyond slogans and confront the uncomfortable origins of the so-called War on Terror. After the Cold War ended, the world that had created Osama bin Laden no longer needed him. The same networks that were once tolerated or indirectly supported suddenly became a liability. The United States shifted its narrative rapidly, transforming former allies into absolute enemies. Bin Laden was no longer a financier of anti-Soviet resistance. He was redefined as a symbol of global terror. This transformation was not only political but psychological. A complex geopolitical history was reduced to a single face and a single name that could carry fear, anger, and moral clarity. After the attacks of September 11th, this simplification became total. Bin Laden was presented as an almost mythical mastermind, an omnipresent threat capable of striking anywhere at any time. This image justified extraordinary responses. Wars were launched, borders hardened, and surveillance expanded on a scale previously unimaginable. The Patriot Act passed with little resistance, granting the government sweeping powers over communication, finance, and personal movement. Fear did the work that arguments could not. In this environment, nuance became dangerous. Questioning the narrative was framed as disloyalty. Yet behind the image, reality was already diverging. Al-Qaeda was not a centralized army, but a loose network struggling with internal divisions, lack of resources, and declining influence. By the mid-2000s, intelligence reports quietly acknowledged that the organization was weakening. Affiliates acted independently, often ignoring bin Laden's directives. He spent years isolated, moving rarely, communicating through couriers, and obsessively watching news about himself. Documents later recovered revealed a man frustrated by irrelevance, worried about losing control, and aware that his brand was collapsing. He even discussed rebranding Al-Qaeda. These details never dominated headlines. They did not serve the purpose of maintaining a clear enemy. The myth of bin Laden as an ever-powerful architect of terror remained useful. It sustained public support for prolonged military presence abroad and normalized a permanent state of emergency at home. In this sense, bin Laden became less a person and more a narrative tool. He was a necessary villain in a story that demanded one. After the death of Osama bin Laden, the image that had dominated global media for more than a decade slowly began to collapse. For years, he had been portrayed as an all-powerful mastermind, a shadowy figure orchestrating global terror from hidden caves and secret compounds. This image was emotionally effective, politically useful, and simple enough to sustain public fear. Yet the reality uncovered after the Abbottabad raid told a very different story. The documents recovered by US forces revealed a man who was no longer directing a unified movement, but struggling to manage decline, fragmentation, and irrelevance. Bin Laden was isolated, physically weakened, and increasingly disconnected from the groups that once claimed loyalty to him. Internal correspondence showed frustration rather than control. He complained about the actions of regional affiliates, criticized their brutality, and worried that indiscriminate violence against civilians was alienating potential supporters. Instead of commanding a disciplined organization, he appeared as an aging ideologue attempting to influence a network that had already begun to move beyond him. By the late 2000s, Al-Qaeda was no longer a centralized force with clear hierarchy. It had become a loose collection of semi-independent groups, each driven by local conflicts, ambitions, and grievances, rather than a coherent global strategy. This decline was rarely acknowledged publicly. Western governments and major media outlets had strong incentives to preserve the image of a powerful enemy. A weakened villain could not justify endless war, mass surveillance, or permanent emergency powers. Maintaining the illusion of a still dangerous Osama bin Laden helped sustain public fear and political legitimacy. The emergence of ISIS exposed the limits of this narrative. Unlike Al-Qaeda, ISIS rejected secrecy and embraced spectacle, territorial control, and extreme violence as propaganda. Bin Laden's death closed a symbolic chapter, but it did not end the conflict. The enemy had changed long before the story did. After Osama bin Laden's death, the official narrative presented a sense of closure, as if the central chapter of global terrorism had been definitively closed. Yet this feeling was largely symbolic. The structures that sustained extremism were never built around one man, and removing a single figure could not undo decades of political instability, foreign intervention, and ideological conflict. His elimination satisfied an emotional need for justice, but it did not address the deeper mechanisms that allowed groups like Al-Qaeda to emerge. In many ways, the war on terror had already outgrown its original justification. Military operations continued, surveillance systems expanded, and emergency powers became normalized, even as the original enemy faded into irrelevance. The public image of victory masked a strategic ambiguity. Wars launched in the name of defeating terrorism often destabilized entire regions, producing power vacuums that new extremist movements quickly filled. The collapse of state authority in Iraq and Syria became fertile ground for the rise of ISIS, a group far more brutal, visible, and territorially ambitious than Al-Qaeda ever was. ISIS did not operate from the shadows. It ruled cities, filmed executions, and weaponized social media with unprecedented efficiency. Its emergence revealed a fundamental flaw in the bin Laden-centered narrative. The problem was never a single leader or organization. It was a recurring cycle driven by unresolved grievances, foreign occupation, sectarian division, and ideological radicalization. Focusing public attention on one symbolic villain delayed a broader reckoning with these systemic causes. Extremism adapted, changed form, and survived long after its most famous face disappeared. Bin Laden's story ultimately exposes the limits of simplified moral frameworks in geopolitics. He was neither a supernatural mastermind nor the origin of global violence. His death did not end terrorism, just as his rise did not begin it. His legacy lies in how his image was used to shape fear, justify policy, and sustain a permanent sense of threat. Wars are fought not only with weapons, but with stories. In the end, the story of Osama bin Laden is less about one man and more about how power constructs meaning. His rise was made possible by Cold War strategy, his survival by regional chaos, and his symbolic importance by political necessity. His death did not dismantle extremism, but it did reveal how deeply modern wars depend on narrative control. The war on terror promised safety through force, yet delivered a world where surveillance became permanent, wars endless, and enemies endlessly replaceable. Entire societies learned to live under constant monitoring, justified by fear and framed as protection. What was temporary became permanent, and emergency powers slowly turned into normal governance. Bin Laden was not the beginning, and he was not the end. He became a symbol shaped by media repetition, political speeches, and public fear. His image carried emotional weight far beyond his actual operational power, allowing governments to explain complex conflicts through a single name and a single face. He was a mirror reflecting how fear can be weaponized, how history can be simplified, and how complex realities are reduced to single villains. This simplification made war easier to sell, harder to question, and almost impossible to end. Once a narrative is accepted, facts become secondary to emotion. Understanding this does not excuse violence, but it exposes the cost of refusing to question official stories. Because when wars are sustained by myths rather than solutions, peace becomes unreachable. The enemy may change names, but the structure that produces conflict remains the same.